Needles and ink. So to be a little bit more specific about the needles and the ink to use for black work. With the needles, I don't care much about different brands or different fancy stuff. I was very minimalistic and simple. I believe that when you can use a cheap needle, you can use any needle. And I don't really like to support this fancy stuff in the tattoo industry when stuff get just unlabeled and like, you know, you buy Vaseline everywhere. It does the job. Why to have a tattoo Vaseline will cost 4 times the price? There's no point. The same with needles. Cheap needles works absolutely fine for me. I personally prefer anyway the 035, I think it is. It's the thickness of the needle. So that's like the biggest needles. There exists a lot of like even finer needles, long tape, super spiky and all this fancy stuff. It is nice needles and stuff for when you make super realistic, super small stuff or different genres of styles of tattooing. But for simple black work, dot work, our Quetzalcoatl style, all the normal stuff, I can absolutely recommend simple, normal, big needles. Don't go all too crazy. Use them as they is. With magnums, the main thing is I not really use the round magnums. I always use the straight magnums because I can use them to make lines in certain places. I can use to go with the corner in, so I can use them for filling better, for effects, for a lot of things, and I have a little bit more control. When it comes to even bigger needles, I mentioned before quick, I'm not such a fan of using big needles. When you want, I recommend to test out there, especially when it goes to the 50 magnums or up, like round ones, like the round magnums who are a little bit carved in the front. They can be very handy, and for a lot of people it's easier to make a bigger black with it. For this also, the best thing is buy both, try both and find what works for you. See, does really big needles even work better for you, or you also run good with just 50 magnums. Don't forget, like when I speak from small needles and I speak from a 15 magnum is still a very, very big needle. Most normal tattoo artists very, very little or never use a 15 magnum. So just be clear that when I speak from small needles, it's still a very big needles. Also, not all the black work have to be big. It's a genre. It's known that it's get bigger. It's a genre we're getting more known for big, large pieces, back, front pieces, bodysuits, and so on. So that's why I try to be a little bit more specific about what it is to work a little bit bigger. But that's pretty much about the needles. I will get a little bit in depth in the different techniques I will use later on. When it comes to the ink, we are very simple. I can recommend you Kurosumi outlining ink. We pretty much use nothing else, and this for 20 years and for nothing else. No big fancy whatever, no super expensive stuff. It's a very, very old ink, very known, very long in business. It does a perfect job. The new version like this one is even legal in the new Europe lines of colors and stuff. So you don't have to worry much. They also have the filling ink, the filling black. I personally never used the filling blacks. I tried a lot of different blacks from different companies, from different brands. And for me personally, the outline ink, it seems like the pigments stuck a little bit more together. What maybe makes it a little more difficult to fill, beside of the special fillings black, they kind of blow out and run a little bit under the skin. So the black looks a little bit more even, but in my opinion, you will get the darkest black with the outline ink. You have the most control. Also, you eliminate a little bit more the risk of stuff blowing out. And also, you don't need to be the fancy guy who have different tattoo blacks and stuff. Keep it simple, keep it easy, because it makes your life easy on the long term. And why having 4 different blacks when one black works for everything? Needles and ink. So this is probably one of the most important things when it comes to equipment and everything, because basically you can make full tattoos just with a bottle of ink and 1 needle. You can use the handbook technique, which we have made the last time some special tutorial and workshops about. And I think that is the most fundamental basic of tattooing. I have a lot of friends and people who kind of started like this. Also in my roots, all my first tattoos was just simple, done by hand, because it shows you that is the only things you pretty much need to make a tattoo. So in my eyes, the most important things to understand what needles to use for what and what color. Understand the different colors we have. Try around all the stuff. That's one of the most fundamental things. So let's start with the needles. I will explain you the different groups of needles we have, the different sort of needles and what we use it for what things. So first of all, we have basically two different types of needles. The first ones are round grouped needles and the second one is flat needles. So that means the needles are grouped that they look flat and the needles are grouped that they look round. I will directly show you an example from each of them. So that is kind of the main overall topic of the needles. Then you have to understand we have, with the round ones, we have liners, we have shaders. There are different variations of what you can use round ones and why you can use 15 ones. I will basically explain you what stands on the packages. When we see here, that's a 9RS. The RS means, the R means for round. That means it's round. And the S means shader. And the 9 means 9 needles. 9 needles means there are like 9 needles in a circle. And then we have the magnum with the round, which will be 9 needles in a long. So both are shaders. And that's a magnum shader, 9 magnum shader or magnum. Both will be used for shading or for filling, but they completely behave different. And that is kind of what stands on the package. When there's a 9RL, it means pretty much it's 9 needles, but it's a liner. And the main difference now between liner and shader when it comes to the round, when you have the needles grouped, the liners, they are kind of like, they are more together. As you can see, this is a 14 round liner, and here you can see very nice how the tip is bent almost together. So like all the needles are not straight, they kind of like bend in. So that the same amount of needles make a smaller field than when they open. And they're tighter, they tie together. So the line you make with, it's just fuller of ink, so it's better for the lines, while a little bit a more open line, open needle, it's better for filling, because when you make the filling, you will make the circles anyway, or like the zigzag or whatever technique you use, and it's easier to fill full fields. While a liner, it's more almost like it cuts kind of in the skin. So you don't want to use a liner for filling because it damages the skin a lot more, because it's kind of a sharper point. So that's pretty much the two big main difference when it comes to round liner. And then the size of the line depends on how much needles you choose. There exists like single liner, which is only one teeny needle, but pretty much no one I know used that. And I think the normally smallest needle which get used by tattoo artists are 3. That means three needles together as a line. But for making lines, like real lines, it's almost too small. And it not looks so nice. It's mostly used for making some highlight lines, some detail, fine line stuff. But it's very small. And when it comes to liner, the smaller the liner, the higher the risk. You cut the skin, you cause blowouts, because it's very easy to go very deep in the skin. And you go too deep, the skin is like open up, like under the ink spreads and creates kind of this blowout. That means it looks like a black line and you will have this bluish blowout around the line. It looks very, very ugly and you really don't want this. That's why in my opinion it's always good to take a little bit a bigger line, maybe make even the motif a little bit bigger. It's a lot safer to start with than to go with very small lines. And then there's pretty much no limit to the top. I remember I experimented with 100 and 150 liners, which I made myself. All this works, but at some point it makes no sense anymore to have a big line like this. Then you will probably just put 2 lines next to each other, or make like 2 lines and fill in between. And I would say in most normal use, the 15 round liner or 18 round liner is probably the absolutely maximum what you would ever use. And for the average outline, I like to use between a 9 round liner or 11 round liner. And yeah, quick to the round shader. So I personally don't use round shader a lot for shading, because in my eyes you use a round shader. There is some purpose for it when you have like fine line stuff to a flat magnum, but mostly I would say you use a magnum, like a flat magnum. There's always, you can come in and fill it even with a really big one. And in my eyes it always makes sense to use the magnum for filling instead of the round shader. But I have to say I personally liked a lot to use a round shader for making outlines also, because you can have a lot more saturated fat outlines, but you have to just put the outlines in a little bit slower. Another thing is what you always can do, you kind of don't need to buy round shaders. You can just take a round liner like this, yes, where the tip like this is together. And what you can do is you take a lighter and you seen it? You melt the bottom, and
soldering
is heat up by this, and then the tension they put by making the needle, where they put the needles in front together and then they soldering it, and you open it up, and no, I have made a round shader out of a round liner, because that's the only difference. So in my eyes, you just buy round liners and you can always make round shaders out of it. For some purposes, like when you make the inside of a palm or some spaces, it's just so more convenience to have a more open line. And I always like to make my outlines with a more opened up liner. But when it comes, as example, to dot work, and you have single dots, then I always like to have them more packed together, because the dot itself will be much more solid and looks much nicer than when you have a round shader. So it both have its purpose, and it always depends on what you do and what you make. It's always good to experiment a little bit and what you like. But I can definitely tell you, for making bigger fields of filling, round shader are not the best thing. So let's speak about magnums. First of all, there exist like flat ones where the needles are like in one row. And that's a group of needle I absolutely not recommend, because when you use this for filling, it's so easy to cut the skin, because it's like really like a sideways line of needles, and you can cause easy blowouts, you easy can damage the skin. So what a magnum is, and I think this is called a flat shader. So that's a flat shader. And then they have the double, which it's just like 2 lines of needles on it. It's pretty much the same when you take 2 flats and put it onto each other. I also not really recommend it. The most common use type of shedder is the magnum. The magnum means they take one line of needles and then they split it. Like from the front, they split it left by right. So one goes up and one goes down, one goes up and one goes down. What makes a needle like this? So that means there's always, when you look on the line, a gap in between the needles, and the needles are like spreaded. That means you have the same amount of needles and you not have like a ridiculous amount of needles like in a double flat, where it's more than enough needles to make a nice filling. And as I mentioned already before, with the filling you make anyway the bigger circles or bigger zigzag, so you don't need them packed together that close. And that is probably, from all tattooists I know, the most common type of needles you use. They have magnums from 5 to all the way up to 50 to even bigger, you know. There are like people's using hundreds, or they weld different one of them together. There is no end in this, and it always depends on what kind of tattoos you do, how big you do. In my life, I used most of the time the 15 magnums. 15 magnums are, I would say, still small enough to come in smaller fields. Also, you can use the line of the magnum, the edge of the magnum, to have some parts where you not can go in with the full, or you can say you just turn the needle to the side. So let's say you have a piece you want to fill, it's like this, but your needle is this wide. You can just go a little bit sideways and you can fill it anyway. But it's still big enough to make anti-red arms or a lot of really big work. And in my eyes, I used a lot the really big magnums, like the 50 or even a 25, or even bigger ones I made myself, and experimented a lot with it. And under the line I had the feeling I was not much faster doing the black work on big scales than using the small one, because you have to understand, to bring in the color with a really big needle, you need a lot more power on the machine. You have to go probably very slow to get that power out of a machine. So you will be very, very slow. And I just didn't like it so much. But also there are people out there, they use really big magnums. They make really nice big fields of colors or black with it. It all works. But that's definitely kind of the main differences we have when it comes to needle, what you would considerate. And when you start building up a tattoo, you have the design in front of you. Then, especially in the beginning, it can be good. You have your couple of needles and you can just unpack one needle each, and maybe you put yourself a little bit of marking on it, that you know what needle is what and what's the purpose. And then you can just hold the needle in your design. Like, let's take this, and you see the lines, and you can hold the needle and you see, oh, this one is too big, but oh yeah, this one is nice for here. So I use this 15 shedder for that lines, and I use this for the filling. That can be very, very helpful in the beginning, that you just like have a few samples unpacked and not use them again. Just really say, that's my samples, that I can see the different size of it. Let's take these 3 needles, and you already see they have such a different size in it. So it's very good to have something like this lying on the side in the beginning, to really understand how much the needle affect the tattoo, how much the needle affect the size of the lines, what you do with it. And even you take a small needle, remember, you always can open it up, make it a little bit bigger for a kind of different purpose. When it comes to the magnums, there's also 2 different types of magnums. We have the normal magnums in the front. When this is the front where the needles are, it's straight, And then we have the, how are they called? The round magnum, the round edge magnum, I think. And that means the front, it's rounded. I think this big one, this is one like this. And you see it's made like this because when you have such a big needle and you press it in the skin, then it usually presses the skin like bent in like this, and they make it to avoid that a lot of the times with very big needles, then the side is more saturated than the front, similar like this, while with this it kind of equals it out. I would say everything up to a 15 magnum. I never ever used round edged magnums because I think even with the 15 magnums I never really have this, especially when you make nice circles. And I always like to have it more a straight edge because I can use the edges of the magnum also to make some filling and some details sometimes. And honestly, all the time I use even the 50 magnums. I also like to have the flat ones and they worked fine for me. But these days it's crazy of the amount of needles and equipment you can buy, while 20 years back there was not so much difference. Everything was pretty same. Another thing what we have these days is that we have short taper and long taper. I don't know if we even have a difference here of this, but that pretty much means the overall length of the needle. While the long taper, they are longer and the needles itself are spikier, while the short taper are more like shorter, so like they have a different kind of spike. I tried all of this out and I personally not felt a real difference between it. So I always go for the most simple needles, and I try to say all this going crazy and too much into all of this, it not made too much sense for me, and I try to focus to learn more about my skills and the craftsmanship of tattooing and don't depend so much on the equipment. And I think it's good to have an understanding of the equipment we have these days and to know the equipment you have, but maybe it's easier to find a few simple needles who works for you and use them and get the maximum out of this and then go from there. Because I think you start once using 50 different kind of lines, you make yourself crazy and you start overthinking too much what lines you use. And under the line, I think when you are a good craftsman, you can use any needle and make a good line out of it. And then at this point, it don't matter so much anymore. When you buy needles, they usually come in a box. They're not really expensive. They come sterile. And there's a ton of different brands who make different kind of needles. And this is pretty much the normal needles for the normal machines. I showed you before the cartilages, and there the needles look a little bit different from the rotary machines, or at least there are rotary machines who work still with normal needles, so they have the same system in the back. You can just buy all the normal tattoo needles and use them. And then we have the cartilages machines. That's the ones I showed you before. And then for this you buy the needles kind of in the cartilages like this, and they even easier to set up because all what you do is you take the needle out and you see it's kind of a part of the grip together with the needle. The needle is inside, it's safe here because it's inside there, and as soon as you press it in the machine, you see then the needle comes out. It's like a feather inside, and you just click it into the machine and that's all. So that's a really simple system, but I also would say this is also, it's both a very, very simple system. These needles are definitely cheaper than the cartilages, but I would say for the amount what people charge for a tattoo, it doesn't matter. Both of them are not much costs for something like this. So you should not base your decision on the price, because it's both very, very simple. And it doesn't matter when it comes to this sort of needle or the cartilages, they're all labeled the same. 9 round cheddar is a 9 round cheddar, a 15 magnum is a 15 magnum, and all of the stuff is pretty much written the same on it. And you see also on the cartilages, we take one out and we see the 9RL means 9 round liner, and this is pretty much gives you the same line like when you take whatever 9 round liner here. It's a 5 round liner, but like you get this, it's the same front of the needle, just with a different system. So when it comes to colors, there are a lot of brands on the market and a lot of choices. And some tattoo artists, they have a base of colors and mixing it. They mix it in the cups. Let's say you have a red and you want a darker red, you just add some black or some darker color, and it's pretty much the same as any color you mix. And some artists I know, they have different colors in the cups and they mix it on the needle itself, but that's a very uncommon mixing technique. But I think these days colors are not so super expensive anymore, and most tattoo artists have just all the colors like they need. So when they want the red and they want a lighter red and a darker red, just get the colors. You don't need to make mixing or anything. It's also very beneficial because let's say you're in the middle of a tattoo, you mixed your own light red, and then you run out of the color, you need some more, and you have to remix it and that it fits together. So I think the safest is to just mix the color itself. There is a ton of different blacks. We use the Kurosumi since 2 decades. It's in my eyes one of the best blacks. I tried a lot of the blacks, but I think these days there's so much good colors out. I think it's more about a feeling of what color you like. In my eyes, the best is always to get a couple of good brands where I get recommended from a lot of tattoo artists or who get used a lot, and find the color you like the most. It's a little bit about feeling of how the colors is for you for tattooing, how it is for you to work with, because like with the black, some blacks behave a little bit different than others, and it's a little bit to filter out. Also at this point, especially when we come to the colors, we have to mention they changed last year in the Europe Onion a lot of the laws. So a lot of the old colors, like these colors here, they are now forbidden in the Europe Onion, and we had to switch a lot to new brands and find new colors which are now regulated and allowed. But I think in most parts of the world, a lot of the colors like Star Bright and Intense, they are still allowed. So just make sure that you know about a little bit the laws, and then you're fine. But right now, it's kind of crazy, because right now, you can in not one professional tattoo shop buy these colors anymore. They're forbidden. You cannot order it anymore. Also, you cannot order it from the States. But I buy this cheap tattoo kit and the colors in there, they send it, and they're definitely not on the list of allowed colors. So, doesn't matter. Make sure that you check out what colors are allowed, because first of all, you don't want to harm anyone, and second, you don't want to pay big fines or anything because you still use colors who are not allowed anymore. I try to get some colors here together to show you different brands, because we also know there's a lot of you not in the Europe Onion, so for you this regulation don't matter, but there are probably some regulation in the country you are, which I don't know from because I don't. So just make sure that you check that out quick. So this as example is the same color we used before. They made a couple of adjustments and it's now safe here. So they done with a lot of other brands, and One of the brands we used before a lot was Star Bright and Intense and Eternal. I can highly recommend these brands. And now we use a lot the Kurosumis, the same brand then we use the black and the world famous tattoo colors. Right now the regulations are still very early, so we don't have so much colors right now to use, and we cannot be that picky right now. In general line, what was make that we have here as example 5 different brands now is that we as tattooists was not just taking one brand which we like and use all their colors. We tried a lot of colors and then we was find out we really like the red from this brand and it's really nice to tattoo, but the green from this brand we didn't like so much, and then we go to another brand and we have a green which we like more. And that's what I mean. There is not a certain rule that this brand is good color or this brand is the best color, because in my eyes a lot of the brands, all the brands produce good colors for these days, because they're all good brands and good colors. And it's so hard to say because some pigments behave just different than other pigments, and it's a feeling thing. When you feel like, whoa, the red is really nice for me to work with, then do it. And then there's some red from some companies, they're good to work with and they heal good, but they're really bad for cleaning while tattooing, and you destroy your stencil then fast. And then there's a lot of things to considerate into when you buy colors. But I think in the beginning, when you buy colors, there are some brands where they have like this test sets where you can get like 10 colors in really small bottles, and then it's very good. You buy a couple of test sets like this from a few brands and you can just test a couple of colors and see what you like and what not, and how it looks in the skin, how it looks healed, how is it to work with, and you will have a really good understanding of color. Just maybe not buy like a really big bottle in the beginning, just go for smaller bottles, test it, or even the test kits who have even smaller bottles than this, and see how it feels and how it's to work with.
Yeah.
So another thing is, when it comes to black gray, to real gray shading, first, yes, there exists a lot of colors of gray, but then it feels like a color, it's like either a warm gray or a cold gray. It's a color gray. It looks completely different in the skin. While going into gray shading, it's more like when you paint with a pencil and you use make the shades with the pencil. That means it looks lighter because you let more of the paper through. So the same you do on a real black gray, it's less saturated skin. So the lighter tones are because you see more from the skin through, and it's a shading from black to skin. While shading with color grays, it's just a shading in the different tones of the gray. This is a gray as a color and this is a gray as a color. And you see, you can make a shading with that, but that still looks like a gray. It not looks like a unsaturated skin black tone. So that's the very big difference when it comes to black work, gray work, what gray work, but black and gray, like horror style, more black gray realism, all kind of stuff like this. To really separate, it's different to use a gray as a color than to use a gray shading. Some tattoo artists, they just use a black and water it down with color, water it down with water. So they use the black pigments very diluted and to shade. But a lot of the brands like Kurosumi, they also provide the shading colors, which is kind of the almost same color. It's just less pigments in the bottle. It's already kind of watered down, but like a little bit different than when you water it down. So it's very nice to make gray work with it. And what we personally do, we have a couple of bottles and we even take the gray shade and we mix it down with water, and we, as example, use a bottle and we make a marking in half, so we know we fill half of the bottle with the gray and half of the bottle with water. So that means every time we want to have a kind of a mix of the gray, we can make a new mix and we have the same mix. So it's very good, because especially when it comes to to black and gray, a lot is about feeling at some point, because it always looks very dark and it feels very light. And especially the lighter your gray comes, that means it's very little pigments in the skin. That means also the red irritation of the skin is very dominant. So it's very hard to see and it always looks darker. So that means at one time you get really used to a gray tone, to a gray shading, then it's you have the feeling and you know how it looks healed. So you know the amount of gray do you have to put in to have a certain effect when it's healed. While when you use a light gray like this as a color, you can just fill it and you don't have to worry about putting too much pigments in, because it will not get darker than this. But when you use a gray shade and you go 3 times over, it can become very dark. It can at some point become black, because it's black pigments watered down. So that's kind of the main topics when it comes to gray. And the same is with colors, because you can use a lighter red and make a darker red out of it, but you also can water down any color and it will have a completely different effect than it has when you take a lighter red. So you can create kind of this black and gray feel with a red or with any kind of color, and just take the color, water it down and make a shading like this, and it will look completely different. That's a technique. Sometimes it's get used to make kind of a shading in a color. When you, let's say you have a light green and you want to make a dark shading on it, then you could use this technique to make the dark green just a little bit water in, just to make it easier for you, especially in the beginning. While a lot of professionals, they have so much feeling in their needle, they just know that they go very soft and use very little pigments. But especially in the beginning, you use a dark color to make the shading. You go in once too deep or once too much. There is no reverse. That's why it can be very handy to understand what it happens when you water down some colors, because you just have a little bit more room for error, especially in the beginning.
Yeah, I would say if you have a good machine, it's easier to tattoo with a good machine. Then I would not use too small needles, but also not too big. Like maybe, I don't know. I always use an 11 liner for dot work, but also this depends on the machine. Some make bigger dots, some not. And for me, I only use 15 Magnum for stuff. But if you like fill out small patterns, then it's better to use a smaller Magnum. Yeah, colors are more difficult to do. So it's better to start with black, because colors need more. Yeah, you have to be better with tattooing when you use colors, because they don't go in so good and don't stay so good.